to devise alternatives to at least some of the rites and rituals that religion provides, certainly funerals, certainly marriages. Music, well, I've already said something about that. But I do agree with Professor Ayala that no doubt there are many people who need religion, and far be it from me to sort of pull the rug from under their feet. If they don't want to read my book, then they're welcome not to.
Francisco, thanks so much for your comment. And maybe this will go a little ways to alleviating your disappointment. And I'm obviously not saying that all of science or even much of science is incorrect, but at any one time, some of it is. And I think we as scientists, and this is my point, need to be sensitive to people, to lay people who can't tell which is correct. And so they then are put in the position of having to listen to authorities, and the authorities are usually chosen by the media. And it's in this context that some of the skepticism about science arises, and especially when it's delivered as medical prescriptions that they follow, that they then have to go back on and not do later. So I think from an educational point of view, and I know you're committed to science education, I think it would help if we were more sensitive to the inability of the general public to discern where the science is correct and where it isn't. And so to cut them a little slack on this when they do doubt good science, and that we should go the extra mile to try to explain what we are actually convinced of in terms which can reach different constituencies.
Okay. Larry?
Just say who you are.
I just have a quick question.
Say who you are.
Oh, Larry Hinman from the University of San Diego. I have a quick question for both the panelists, and that is, it seems like one of the dangers in a discussion such as this is that we compare the best of science with the worst of religion. You know, and I'm concerned that some of that happened earlier today. And I think particularly when we talk about best, it can be in either of two senses, either an epistemic sense, that is getting the story right, you know, or it can be in a moral sense. And I think some of the strongest force of Sam Harris's comments this morning, at least to me, came about from his deep moral concern about the possible damage that this commitment to religion could have. But it seems as though science, too, you're pointing out in part, I think, the dark epistemic side, perhaps, but it also has its own dark moral side. And it would seem like any discussion of these would have to look at both dimensions in both religion and science. And so if you have any comments.
Shall I go?
Yes.
Well, that's actually the sense in which I'm concerned with the view of nature that's implicit in the or explicit in the sexual selection narrative, because it's a view of social conflict as basic, as human nature and as biological nature. And if that's true, fine, so be it. But we haven't had a class of hypotheses on the table to challenge that. And because to do so actually does unfortunately trace back to Darwin, and it's not, I think, socially acceptable to be skeptical of Darwin in that regard. But that's what a lot of people are pointing out, is that that from this worldview comes a sense of ethics. It informs ethics, even if it's not value in and of itself. And I think we do have to worry about the moral implications of it, of scientific research. And I thank you for the question.
Do you have a thought on that, Richard?
But well, I worry about the prioritizing of putting the emotional, poetic, moral implications of science ahead of the science itself. I mean, I don't actually care whether it fosters a locker room mentality, or whether it's about conflict or cooperation. I care whether it's true. And to take the particular example of the gene or the individual as the unit of selection, I don't want to approach that question by saying what is best for human society, what gives the best moral lessons for humanity. I want to approach it from the point of view of how Darwinian theory works, and so I want to say something like, in natural selection, what are the units that actually survive or fail to survive? Individuals are not that, because individuals, at least in sexual species, only exist in one copy each, and so individuals are not the sort of things you can count the frequency of. They're not sort of things whose frequency changes as generations go by. Genes are. Natural selection, evolution by natural selection, or indeed evolution period, consists of changing gene frequencies manifested in changing phenotypes in populations, and the gene frequencies change as a consequence of the survival or failure to survive, the reproduction or failure to reproduce of individuals that contain those genes. To the extent that male bodies and female bodies have different optimal ways of doing things, you're going to get particular male and female expectations. This is all scientific theory. It may be wrong, but it's science. We don't judge it by criteria such as, is it a nasty, ruthless, unpleasant view of the world? Or, I mean, wouldn't we all feel better if we had a nice, cooperative, friendly, unselfish view of the world? Well, maybe we would, but what matters is what's true, not what makes us feel good.
Yeah, but there's no disagreement on that point. The question is whether or not, as I mentioned earlier, the hypotheses that are on the table explore the space of all possible hypotheses very effectively. And this is where the sociology of the science comes in, because there's a non-random generation of hypotheses to span the hypothesis space. And the hypotheses that are generated have a history and a connection, and a connection with power and so forth. And so I agree with you that if nature is red tooth and claw, if that's the fact of the matter, fine. But has that actually been tested?
Okay, so I understand you to be saying that if that is the fact of the matter, then they'll have to live with that. But the effect of these political biases that you're talking about is to restrict the range of hypotheses that we examine.
Yes.
Rather than to prejudge what we're going to end up feeling is true.
Nicely
well, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, nicely put.
Pat, do you have anything?
Yeah, I was sort of taken with both talks, perhaps in contrast to Francisco. And it did occur to me that we do actually have an example of someone with both a religious perspective and with religious power on the one hand, but someone who wants to be scientifically accurate and not just a teaspoon of sugar makes the medicine go down, and that's the Dalai Lama. And it seems that he is genuinely interested in what the science actually says and doesn't want to soften it down. Wants to have an accurate story and the most up-to-date story, both with regard to molecular biology, but certainly with regard to the brain. And his curiosity about this, I think, is really very interesting. It also seems to me, having been in one of these sort of tutorial sessions with him, that the metaphysical baggage that he brings to bear is really very, very minimal. And to the degree that it's there, it's pretty darn hard to see, or at least in the sense that he doesn't sort of foist it on you. What they do emphasize, on the other hand, is, and I think this is something that Joan is worried about, and it was something that Steve Weinberg was worried about, and that is the sense of community, the sense of belonging to a group that is not always easy in a very large country or in a very large city, where people can share things, talk about problems, and so forth, and typically religions do provide a certain amount of that. The other part of the story does have to do with ethics, but again, it's a kind of ethics that doesn't talk about rules and it doesn't talk about laws. It talks about acquiring certain virtues and certain skills for navigating the social world, where the specific form that might take would depend on the nature of the conditions.